Those Russian oligarchs sure do have it tough. If they're not dodging sanctions or ending up YouTube sensations, they're desperately trying to hold on to their fortunes, often to no avail. Mikhail Khodorkovsky is probably the most famous example we've got of a Russian oligarch who lost everything. Well, almost lost everything. Back in the late 90s, Khodorkovsky was the richest man in Russia. Educated as a chemist, he set up his own cafe in 1986 and soon expanded into different markets, finally consolidating them into a single privately held banking company called Menatep. Because Khodorkovsky ran the accounts for local and state government bodies, he was able to grow Menatep at a staggering pace. Unfair? Sure, but that's oligarchy, baby.
The Soviet Union? I thought you guys broke up.
Yes, that's what we wanted you to think.
In 1995, one of Khodorkovsky's holding companies bought Yukos, the second largest oil company in Russia, and he soon began pursuing the purchasing of another. To say buying Yukos was a bit shady would be an insult to shade. Short version is he bought it through a rigged auction. Khodorkovsky's scramble for power came to a sudden stop in 2000 when he came afoul of Vladimir Putin. The newly appointed president of Russia took great pains to keep wealthy Russians out of politics. When Khodorkovsky refused to fall in line, he was hit with a long list of criminal charges. We're not picking sides here because Khodorkovsky wasn't squeaky clean, and Putin is, well, Putin. But it didn't help his case that he supported the West over Putin. And I'll jail you every time. In 2005, Khodorkovsky was convicted of fraud and sentenced to 9 years in prison. A few years into his sentence, he faced further charges of embezzlement and money laundering and had his sentence extended. Meanwhile, Yukos was forced to pay $50 billion to its shareholders. Khodorkovsky's fortune dropped from $15 billion to $170 million, but it's said that he may not even have that much. He was released from prison in 2013 thanks to a pardon from Putin, ironically enough, and moved to London soon after. There, he built a one-man brand for himself as a commentator on Russian politics. He's even got his own YouTube channel. Oleg Tinkov was one of 106 Russian individuals who were sanctioned by the UK following his country's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. In an attempt to wriggle out of these sanctions, Tinkov took to Instagram to explain that he wasn't an oligarch at all. Helpfully, he even used the hashtag #IamNotAnOligarch. And we all know hashtags are legally binding and accurate, right? Right? Well, this ingenious strategy failed to pay dividends, and Tinkov's bank, the cleverly named Tinkov Bank, quickly lost 90% of its overall value. In what Tinkov himself called a desperate fire sale, he then sold his bank to Vladimir Platonin, a prominent oligarch and the fifth richest man in Russia. By October 2022, Tinkov had renounced his Russian citizenship and openly decried Putin's war against Ukraine, writing on Instagram, "I can't and won't be associated with a fascist country that started a war with their peaceful neighbor and is killing innocent people daily." This wasn't the first hit Tinkov had taken to his finances either. Only a year earlier, he had pleaded guilty to tax fraud against the United States and paid $500 million in penalties. This, plus the devaluation of Tinkov Bank following its sanctions, took Tinkov's fortunes from $9 billion to less than $1 billion. Still, he had just enough money left over to move him and his family to Switzerland, where he now splits his time between cycling, skiing, and drinking expensive wines. So maybe it's not all bad. Platon Lebedev was Mikhail Khodorkovsky's business partner, his alleged partner in crime, and one imagines his BFF. They had worked together running Yukos, were both arrested in 2003, separately but together kinda, and faced the same crimes and received the same sentence. But although Khodorkovsky was released in 2013, Lebedev remained in prison until 2014. Lebedev didn't have nearly as much money as Khodorkovsky either, although he still had about $1 billion to his name. Beyond these basic facts, things get a little murky. For instance, Amnesty International in 2011 declared both Khodorkovsky and Lebedev to be prisoners of conscience, claiming they'd both been harassed and mistreated over the course of their trial and imprisonment.
It is time for both men to be set free and for justice to be served in Russia.
A year earlier, the British Parliament had denounced Khodorkovsky and Lebedev's trial as politically motivated and cited unfair treatment that they faced in prison. Mikhail Khodorkovsky's official website says that Lebedev was kept in a penal colony for political exiles and only allowed 6 visits a year. That said, this information might be best taken with a grain of salt, considering it's taken from, Mikhail Khodorkovsky's official website. The last we heard in 2015, Lebedev had been forbidden from leaving Russia. The Russian government claimed that he still owed $276 million in taxes and had so refused to issue him a passport. Of course, this information might best be taken with a grain of salt too, considering it's taken from, Russia. Vladimir Gusinsky came from humble beginnings, having worked as a cab driver in the mid-80s. Unlike many of his fellow oligarchs, he didn't make his money from oil, mining, steel, or any of the other industries privatized by the Russian government following the collapse of the Soviet Union. Instead, he made his money flipping houses. Then, in 1993, he started what became Russia's biggest independent media company, NTV. How independent? When Putin came to power in 2000, NTV made fun of him by using a big comical Putin doll. As you might expect, things went very badly very quickly for Mr. Gusinsky. That year, armed men in ski masks raided NTV's offices. The Russian government subsequently accused Gusinsky of stealing $10 million in a privatization deal. Gusinsky had already fled the country for the United States a year before, leaving a Russian state-controlled gas company, Gazprom, to take over NTV after the raid. At the time, Gusinsky made great efforts to warn the West about Putin's rise to power. He once said, "Any totalitarian regime must produce fear in the country. Putin must demonstrate to any potential opponent what will happen to him. Business cannot fight him." Gusinsky never went back to Russia. Still, while he lost a whole lot of money and influence in his flight from his homeland, he had enough left over to buy a $7 million mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut. He's since become embroiled in a morass of long-distance business dealings across multiple countries. In fact, according to Agents Media, he currently owes more debt than his assets are worth, by about $1.45 million. There's plenty of other billionaires who've lost their scratch too. Here are a few others from around the world that went broke, and then some. A few of these names you'll probably recognize.
Vijay Mallya has sometimes been called the Indian Richard Branson. He turned his family brewing business into a massive conglomerate, and he also made money in chemicals, fertilizer, and an airline. But he also played as hard as he worked. His birthday celebrations included performances from stars like Enrique Iglesias and Lionel Richie. He even bought a stake in a Formula One racing team. Meanwhile, his company was having problems paying its staff. Mallya's airline owed employees back pay plus more than $1 billion in loans. In 2015, the authorities raided his homes and offices, so he fled India for Britain in 2016. But he wasn't out of the reach of the law, as he managed to get arrested twice in 2017 for defaulting on his loans and money laundering. On paper, Elizabeth Holmes was unbelievably impressive. She started her first business in high school and at age 19 dropped out of Stanford to develop an idea that would revolutionize the blood testing industry. Since she was afraid of needles, she thought there must be a way to do all diagnostic tests from just a finger prick of blood. That idea became Theranos, a company eventually valued at $9 billion.
And we'd like to see a world in which every person gets access to this type of basic testing.
That meant Holmes was the youngest self-made female billionaire at the time. She attracted investors like mogul Rupert Murdoch and board members like Henry Kissinger. On paper, everything was great. Unfortunately, when things moved from paper to the real world, they all fell apart. Theranos was basically one big scam. None of the cutting-edge technology Holmes trumpeted actually worked. Former employees reported a culture of secrecy and fear that let the con go on too long. Now there's an HBO documentary and a best-selling book covering how Holmes pulled it off. That kind of chicanery gets you in big trouble. Holmes was booted from Theranos, which eventually closed completely. Brazilian entrepreneur Eike Batista once openly bragged that he was going to become the richest person in the world. This wasn't a completely crazy goal, since he was already the 8th richest person and worth $35 billion. But then things went very south very quickly. This oil and mining tycoon was a cheerleader for his home country, particularly Rio de Janeiro. He donated cars to the police, renovated a famous hotel, and helped clean up an important lake before the 2016 Summer Olympics. But then Batista managed to lose his fortune in a single year. First, his oil company filed for bankruptcy in 2013, then the Brazilian economy tanked in 2014. But the final nail in the coffin came in January 2017 when he was caught up in a wide-ranging corruption scandal with hundreds of business people and Brazilian government officials charged. In 2018, Batista was sentenced to 30 years in prison for paying $16.5 million in bribes. But a year later, he was still just under house arrest, and it was a very loose house arrest, since he was walking the streets and talking to reporters. But that didn't mean things were looking up for him. In 2019, he was fined $134 million for insider trading and banned from running a public company for 7 years. Bernie Madoff is now famous for running the largest Ponzi scheme of all time, but for a while he was known as one of the most brilliant men on Wall Street. After graduating from college in 1960, he founded his investment firm with $5,000 he saved from working as a lifeguard. It wasn't until the 1980s that his company turned into a Ponzi scheme. People invested with Madoff because he promised them amazing returns on their money, which he then paid using money from newer investors. Then the newer investors were paid with the investments of even newer people. Madoff stood out from other companies thanks to his exclusivity. You had to ask to invest with him, and he wouldn't necessarily say yes. This was catnip for the rich and powerful. Being able to invest with Madoff became a mark of prestige for people like Steven Spielberg and Kevin Bacon. Madoff managed to keep his scheme going an impressively long time and became a billionaire himself in the process. But the 2008 financial crash was too much for his fake business to take. He admitted he'd lost his clients $50 billion and was arrested for securities fraud. In 2009, he was sentenced to 150 years in prison. Poor Alan Stanford. He worked so hard at being a crook, but no one knows who he is because he only ran the second largest Ponzi scheme of all time. Since it was discovered just 2 months after Bernie Madoff's, Stanford didn't get nearly the notoriety he deserved. The native Texan liked to live big. He was listed on the Forbes 400 in 2008 worth around $2.2 billion. Even though he made all this money totally illegally, he had no problem spending it. In just 3 years, he put down $100 million just on aircraft, including helicopters and Learjets. He spent $12 million to make his yacht 6 feet longer. He was even knighted by the Caribbean island of Antigua in 2006. Stanford started his first offshore bank in 1985. Like Madoff, he promised absurd returns on investment. There were rumors about how he did it, and as early as 1997, the SEC knew something was up. A financial expert who toured the bank in 2006 said that it was obviously a Ponzi scheme because the staff and infrastructure were completely inadequate. Everything fell apart in February 2009, and Stanford is now broke and serving a 110-year prison sentence. Icelandic businessman Bjorgolfur Gudmundsson has had an extremely interesting life. He went from furniture packer and law student to billionaire and philanthropist. In the 1990s, he spent a year in prison for shady bookkeeping. When he got out, he went to Russia to rebuild his fortune, which meant defying the mafia in St. Petersburg. He married his wife after she left her previous husband, George Lincoln Rockwell, the founder of the American Nazi Party, who was later assassinated. He became Iceland's second billionaire, after his own son, and had business interests in shipping, publishing, food, communications, and property. He financially supported a symphony, rock stars, and students. A promising soccer player in his youth, he also bought West Ham United FC in 2006. In March 2008, Gudmundsson was worth $1.1 billion, but by December, his net worth was zero. When Iceland's second-largest bank collapsed during the financial crisis, it wiped him out completely. His company went into liquidation and he sold West Ham. In August 2009, Gudmundsson filed for bankruptcy with the biggest personal bankruptcy claim in the world ever at that point. He told the judge he faced, quote, almost complete lack of income. And the hits kept on coming. In 2015, he was charged in one of the largest fraud cases in French history. Patricia Kluge got her money the old-fashioned way, as in she was a former belly dancer and model who became the third wife of billionaire John Kluge, who was 34 years her senior. They got hitched in 1991 and for 9 years lived an extravagant jet-set lifestyle. Their home base was a 23,500 square foot, 45-room mansion in Virginia. Their guests were expected to wear tweeds, were waited on at dinner by liveried footmen, and were driven around in horse-drawn carriages. In 1990, the gossip rags were fed in a big way when the Kluges divorced. John Kluge was the richest man in the world, and in order to be free of his wife, he gave her a reported $1 billion, the biggest divorce settlement ever at that point. But Patricia majorly overextended herself. In 2010, she started auctioning off everything from jewelry to guns to designer clothing. But it wasn't enough. She had to sell her beloved winery to Donald Trump of all people, who kindly gave her a job there after she sold it. But ultimately, she didn't raise enough money to stave off bankruptcy, and Trump even fired her from her vineyard job after just 1 year. In 2008, Forbes listed Irish businessman Sean Quinn as the 164th richest person in the world, with a net worth of $6 billion. His meteoric rise is impressive. He left school at age 14 and then borrowed £100 to start a business selling gravel. He built that into one of Ireland's most successful companies, getting involved with insurance, concrete, glassmaking, hotels, and a bank with 8,000 employees total. At one point, he was the richest man in Ireland. In November 2011, Quinn declared bankruptcy in the United Kingdom, the biggest bankruptcy case in the country's history. A couple months later, he also declared bankruptcy in Ireland. He claimed that the bank calling his loans had a vendetta against him, but the Irish Banking Resolution Corporation said it was just trying to recover 2 billion euros the Quinn family owed them. In November 2012, Quinn ended up in jail on 3 contempt of court charges. When he got out 9 weeks later, he told the BBC that prison was tough and he didn't think he deserved it. By 2019, Quinn's fight with the IBRC was still ongoing. Additionally, his children were trying to convince the court that their father totally screwed them over, and while they might have owned companies on paper, in reality, he was in charge of everything.
But there is this quite simple moral dilemma, which is comply or don't comply, prison, freedom.
Yeah.
Your father chose prison.
Jocelyn Wildenstein has been called the Bride of Wildenstein and Catwoman in the New York tabloids because of her very unique look. She's had plastic surgery done, but she told Paper Magazine in 2018 that her bitter ex-husband exaggerated just how much she went under the knife. As for her sharp eyes and cheekbones, she attributes those to her Swiss heritage. That bitter ex-husband did make her a billionaire, though, even if their divorce was tumultuous. For 20 years, she was married to French art dealer Oleg Wildenstein, but their relationship fell apart suddenly in 1999. Jocelyn got a reported $2.5 billion in the divorce. It's hard to spend that amount of dough, but Wildenstein somehow managed to do it. She was used to spending $1 million a month when she was married, and she kept up that pace after her divorce. She bought $10 million in jewelry and spent $350,000 on a single Chanel dress. In a time before free talk and text, she ran up a $5,000 phone bill every month. In 2018, Wildenstein was surprised when she had to file for bankruptcy. Her $6.38 million in debts included $300,000 to lawyers and $4.6 million on her apartment. She listed her bank account balance as zero and said she was surviving on $900 a month in Social Security plus help from her family and friends.
Jocelyn Wildenstein, you hear her name and you think of what?
A cat face.